Life Affairs, where the truth hides in the shadows. September 16th, 1922. A farmer's lane in New Brunswick, New Jersey. Crab apple trees lining a dirt path locals called DeRussey's Lane, a place where young couples went to be alone. Two bodies were found lying side by side beneath a crabapple tree, a man and a woman, neatly arranged, almost peacefully, except for the bullet holes. The man was Reverend Edward Hall, one of the most respected clergymen in New Jersey, married, powerful, beloved by his congregation. The woman was Eleanor Mills, his choir singer, married to someone else, and deeply, passionately, fatally in love with him. Scattered around their bodies, torn into pieces, and arranged like confetti were dozens of letters. Love letters, written by Eleanor to Edward. Read them, and you understand immediately why someone wanted both of them dead. This is the Hall Mills murder case. It is over 100 years old. It has never been solved. And it remains one of the most scandalous, twisted, and compulsively fascinating true crime stories in American history. To understand why these two people ended up dead under a crab apple tree, you need to understand who they were and what they meant to each other. Reverend Edward Wheeler Hall was 51 years old in 1922. He was the rector of St. John the Evangelist Episcopal Church in New Brunswick, New Jersey, a prestigious, well-attended parish. He was tall, dignified, respected. He had married into money. His wife, Frances Hall, was 7 years older than him, plain-spoken, wealthy, and by all accounts, completely devoted to her husband. Eleanor Mills was 34. She sang in the church choir, a beautiful voice, people said, the kind that filled the whole nave. She was married to James Mills, the church sexton, the man who maintained the building. They were working class. Eleanor was vivid and romantic, where her husband was dull and resigned. Edward and Eleanor had been conducting a secret affair for at least 4 years by the time they died. But it wasn't secret to everyone. Their letters, the ones scattered around their bodies, made that excruciatingly clear. On the morning of September 16th, 1922, a young couple, Raymond Schneider and Pearl Balmer, were walking through DeRussey's Lane when they came across the bodies. Edward Hall was lying on his back. Eleanor Mills was beside him, her head resting on his arm, almost as if they were sleeping together. But the details told a far darker story. Edward had been shot once through the head. Eleanor had been shot 3 times, and her throat had been cut so savagely that her vocal cords were partially removed. Investigators would later suggest this was deliberate, a symbolic mutilation, silencing forever the voice that had sung in that church, the voice that had whispered love into a married man's ear. Their calling cards had been placed on their bodies. Edward's business card sat on his shoe. The love letters were scattered everywhere, not accidentally dropped, deliberately torn and placed around the scene. This was not a robbery. This was not random. This was a message. The investigation immediately turned toward the people with the most obvious motive, the scorned spouses. Frances Hall, Edward's wife, was the primary suspect from day one. She was wealthy enough to hire help. She was cold enough, investigators thought, to organize something this calculated. She had reportedly been seen near DeRussey's Lane on the night of the murders. But Frances Hall was also well connected. Her family had money and influence in New Jersey. James Mills, Eleanor's husband, was also questioned. He seemed oddly composed for a man whose wife had just been murdered. Then there was Willie Stevens, Frances Hall's brother. Willie was eccentric, socially awkward, considered by many to be simple-minded. But witnesses would later place him at the scene, and Willie had a temper that contradicted his bumbling exterior. And finally, the most dramatic figure in the entire case, a woman known only at first as the Pig Woman. Jane Gibson was a local farmer who claimed she had been riding her mule through DeRussey's Lane on the night of the murders. The case went cold almost immediately after the murders. Local authorities fumbled the investigation catastrophically. The crime scene was not properly secured. Hundreds of civilians walked through DeRussey's Lane in the days after the bodies were found, destroying evidence. Frances Hall was never charged in 1922. Then, 4 years later, everything exploded again. In 1926, a tabloid newspaper called the Daily Mirror published a bombshell, a new witness, a new confession, new evidence, allegedly pointing directly at Frances Hall and her brothers. Frances Hall, her brother Willie Stevens, and her cousin Henry Carpenter were arrested and charged with murder. The trial was a sensation unlike anything New Jersey had ever seen. Reporters came from across the country. The courtroom was packed every single day. It was called the trial of the century. The pig woman testified from her hospital bed, wheeled into the courtroom, her voice barely above a whisper. She pointed at Willie Stevens and said, "That is the man I saw." Willie Stevens stared back at her calmly. Then he took the stand himself and delivered one of the most composed, articulate, devastating performances in trial history. Francis Hall, Willie Stevens, and Henry Carpenter were all acquitted. The murders have never been officially solved. 100 years later, true crime historians and amateur investigators are still arguing about who did it. The most widely accepted theory remains that Francis Hall organized the killings, possibly with Willie and another brother, Henry Stevens, and that her wealth and social influence shielded them from justice in 1922 and created enough reasonable doubt to acquit them in 1926. A second theory points to the Ku Klux Klan, whose New Jersey chapter was active and vocal in the early 1920s. A clergyman conducting a public affair with a woman of lower social standing was exactly the kind of moral scandal the Klan positioned itself to punish. Some investigators believe a Klan-connected group carried out the murders as a public warning, and that the theatrical staging of the scene, the scattered love letters, the calling cards, was deliberate Klan stagecraft. A third theory, smaller, stranger, suggests that James Mills knew far more than he ever admitted, that Eleanor had told him she was leaving, that a quiet, overlooked man had finally reached his limit. None of these theories have ever been proven. What we do know is this: two people loved each other in secret. Someone found out. And on a warm September night in 1922, beneath a crabapple tree in New Jersey, they paid for it with their lives. Their killer or killers died free. DeRussey's Lane no longer exists as it did in 1922. The farmland has been built over. The crabapple tree is long gone. But Eleanor Mills's love letters, the ones that were torn up and scattered around her body, were preserved by investigators and later published. You can read them today. And when you do, you understand something very clearly. She knew the love was dangerous. She wrote about it openly, almost defiantly. She wrote, "I know there is a God, for he gave me you." She believed their love was protected by something divine. She was wrong. Subscribe for a new case every week. And tell me in the comments, do you think Francis Hall did it? Or was there someone else in that lane that night?